fellow weirdos. I'm Andy Negative, and today we're going to try to figure out who started punk. Alright weirdos, before we jump in, please take a second to subscribe to the channel for all kinds of guitar and music related stuff. In today's video, we're going to be going over the history of how we got to punk and try to answer the age-old question, who started punk music? Was it the Ramones? Was it the Sex Pistols? I don't know, let's find out. This video is sponsored by me. It's sponsored. I don't have any sponsors, but I do have a wonderful community over on Patreon. And if you'd like to support me in the weird stuff that I do, you can for as little as $1 a month. I'm not gonna force you to do it. I'm not gonna show up at your house and kick you, but it's an option that's available to you, and I'll tell you more about it at the end of this video. With that said, there is a lot to go through, so grab a drink or a snack, or whatever, and we're just gonna dive right into this bad boy, and we're gonna answer this question right now! Who started punk? What is punk? Punk is an aggressive form of rock music that spread in the mid-1970s as an ideology, aesthetic, and would grow to become an archetype of teenage angst and rebellion. Ideology. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, rock music had become incredibly diluted. Softer acts were being labeled as rock groups, while the musicianship of artists like Jimi Hendrix had fallen to the wayside to be taken over by inferior players continuously noodling and endless guitar solos that went nowhere. John Holstrom of Punk Magazine would say punk rock had to come along because the rock scene had become so tame that acts like Billy Joel and Simon and Garfunkel were being called rock and roll. When to me and other fans, rock and roll meant this wild and rebellious music. People were sick and tired of the peace and love, flower power ideology of the hippie movement. Between 1972 and 1975, a string of DIY venues would open in the UK. This would lead to small, non-mainstream bands having a place to perform. Along with several small independent labels like Stiff Records, these pub rock bands would book their own shows, small tours, and release low-cost, low-quality, homebrew DIY recordings. This was music for people who couldn't play music, people with little technical skill, but a desire to create music. This is perfectly distilled in the Sideburns fanzine 3-chord image. This was a culture grown out of the distaste of bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Led Zeppelin. In the UK in 1976, the punk revolution began. The Sex Pistols slogan, "No Future," helped cement a bleakly nihilistic view of this new counterculture that would be mixed with a hard left utopian political view of the bands to come. As Joe Strummer from The Clash said, punk rock is meant to be about freedom. We're meant to be able to do what we want to do. With authenticity as an important viewpoint for this new culture, many would be labeled as posers if they were to take up the aesthetic of punk, but did not uphold the correct moral values set in place by its members. Ironically, this viewpoint shifted and changed so frequently that, as scholar Daniel S. Trauber put it, eventually everyone got called a poser. Musical style. Early punk bands would emulate the simple and minimalist arrangements of 1960s garage rock, focusing on the typical guitar, bass, drums, vocals setup, and standard verse-chorus arrangements played at cranked-up tempos. Early bands like the Ramones and the Sex Pistols were effectively super fast, super stripped-down rock and blues bands. The vocals were frequently nasally and high-pitched, more of a pitched yell than the typical melodic singing of the time. There was still a heavy focus on guitar, however the guitar would be cranked up with overly distorted power chords that sounded more like a buzzsaw. Complicated solos were effectively removed from the genre altogether. The bass in punk was frequently simple and would follow the rhythm of the guitar. The drums were stripped down to the most essential pieces, with the drum beats being simple and driving. The quintessential doo-doo-ka, 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 doo-doo-ka beat being very prevalent. Production on punk music was sparse and minimalistic. Frequently being recorded on simple 4-track recorders, the production would be very dry, with a focus on the authenticity of the live feel of the performance. Punk lyrics were usually frank and confrontational, often focusing on political outrage, class warfare, or intentionally outrageous and gratuitous prose on sex and drugs. Much of it centered around the cultural backlash that was being felt by the youth in the UK in the mid-70s. From the outrageous attack on the British Empire in God Save the Queen, anti-sentimental depictions of relationships in Love Comes in Spurts, and the pure bluntness of Now I Wanna Sniff Some Glue. Punk lyrics and imagery frequently led to records being banned from record shops and radio stations. Aesthetic. The original punk look was based on the typical greaser look from the 1950s. Jeans, t-shirts, and a black jacket, with the punk uniform of torn jeans and a shredded leather jacket being largely associated with the Ramones. However, the quintessential punk look was inspired by Richard Hell of Richard Hell and the Voidoids and television. Hell may have been the first person to adopt the safety pin aesthetic. Though, according to an article by Michael Weldon in a Cleveland newspaper, John D. Morton of the Electric Eels may have been the first to wear a safety pin jacket when he was arrested at one of the band's shows in 1972 or 1973. Richard Hell's music and aesthetic would largely inspire Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood, the Sex Pistols' manager and stylist respectively, who would adopt his style for the band. Westwood claims that Johnny Rotten was the first person to wear a torn t-shirt and that Sid Vicious was the first to wear safety pins. However, due to the time frame, they would have been 14 or 15 and probably wouldn't have met Westwood yet, so it's really hard to say. It also doesn't really matter. Ironically, the clothes that Westwood would go on to make for the Sex Pistols were incredibly expensive, and most of their fans couldn't afford to buy them. This was a large part of the youth destroying their own clothes to make homemade DIY knockoffs of the Sex Pistols style. Punks could also be seen wearing anything from bondage gear inspired by Sui Sui and the Banshees to Patti Smith's straight from the gutter androgyny. Over time, piercings, tattoos, metal studs, and metal spikes would be incorporated into the style of DIY clothes. Punk hairstyle would become a large part of personal expression, ranging from short and spiky to mohawks, large Liberty spikes, and eventually brightly colorful dyed hair. While the stage performance of male punks didn't shift too much from the typical macho rock star approach, except to become maybe more aggressive, female musicians' performances would see a drastic change. No longer would the focus be on the coy sex kitten or bluesy belter. Instead, the women would adopt an aggressive and masculine swagger. This would eventually be fine-tuned into the calculated bad girl image of the Runaways. In terms of dancing, the punk scene is known for pogo, which is basically bouncing up and down in place like you're on a pogo. This dance style is credited to Sid Vicious, who apparently invented it while at a Sex Pistols concert before he joined the band. The scene is also known for moshing or slam dancing, which involves you and your crowd mates throwing yourselves at one another. Some have claimed that this lack of a typical dance style is the reason punk didn't break into the mainstream the same way other genres like disco did, but that seems mostly hyperbolic and frankly kind of stupid. Punk music puts a heavy focus on breaking down the barriers between artist and fan. The crowd was encouraged to come on stage, throw things at the band, and even spit in the band's faces. This closeness may have been what led to so many fans getting involved in the scene, thus propelling the success of the bands through fan zines or magazines, which were essentially free promotion. Zines are still a big part of punk culture even in today's mostly digital world. The precursors to punk, garage rock. In the early 1960s, the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. After this, garage rock bands, which are thought of as the precursor bands to punk, started popping up all over North America. Around the same time, the Kingsmen had a hit with their cover of Louie Louie, which many call the template for punk rock. These garage bands were inspired by harder rock bands coming out of the UK, such as the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, and the Kinks. The increasingly raw sound of American groups like the Sonics, The Seeds and the Remains would predict the sound and style to come with songs like She Lied by the Rockin' Ramrods, generally anticipating the style of the Ramones. In the early 1970s, several rock critics would use the term punk rock to describe the mid-60s garage rock genre, as well as the acts that would follow in the tradition, such as the Stooges. In the UK in 1964, the Kinks would release You Really Got Me, which was heavily inspired by Louie Louie. And in 1965, The Who would release My Generation, which, according to John Reed, anticipated the kind of cerebral mix of ferocity and rebellious posture that would characterize much of the later 1970s punk rock music. Proto-punk. In 1969, the Stooges, led by Iggy Pop, would release their first album. This album was produced by John Cale of the Velvet Underground. Velvet Underground have a reputation of being the first underground rock band and would inspire, directly or indirectly, many of those involved in the creation of punk. In the early to mid 1970s, bands like the New York Dolls, Suicide, Modern Lovers, Death, Devo, and the Electric Eels would form. These bands would push rock towards the inevitable punk that it would become. In the late 1960s, the British band Deviants played a form of psychedelic with a satirical, anarchic edge and a penchant for situational style spectacle, pre-staging the Sex Pistols by nearly a decade. The band would go through many iterations, and in the early 1970s, band leader Mark Bolan would complete his transformation into T-Rex, rejecting the hippie values of humanity and authenticity in favor of glamorous artifice and arrogance that would ultimately bear fruit in the punk attitude and contempt for the hippie generation. David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust character made artifice and exaggeration central. These elements would be picked up by the Sex Pistols and many others. The Doctors of Madness are one of these bands that built on Bowie's presentation and would go on to be considered a punk band. Bands in the London pub rock scene were stripping back their music, playing amped up versions of R&B and rock and roll. By 1974, the scene's top act, Dr. Feelgood, paved the way for bands like the Stranglers and the Cockspares, who would play a role in the punk explosion. As I said before, the growing pub rock scene would create small independent venues where non-mainstream bands could play and record albums to release on independent labels. In 1974, a band called the 101ers would form, whose lead singer would eventually change his name to Joe Strummer, a performer who has been called the link between pub rock and punk rock. However, despite the presence of a shared approach and value system, the pub rock scene wanted to grow on the existing traditions of rock and roll, while the punk rock scene wanted to lash out in its own direction and break tradition. Bands anticipating the forthcoming new punk wave would appear as far as Düsseldorf, Germany, with punk before punk band Nui, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, formed in 1971. A wave of Australian garage rock bands like the Saints were inspired by the Stooges and MC5 and were coming close to what would soon be classified as the punk sound. In Japan, Zuno Kiatsu, or Brain Police, mixed garage psych and folk. The group frequently faced censorship challenges, with their live act reportedly once involving onstage self-love. Etymology and classification. Between the 16th and 18th century, the word punk was a common synonym for the term prostitute. William Shakespeare used it in two of his plays, The Merry Wives of Windsor and Measure for Measure. The term would eventually evolve to describe a young male gangster, hoodlum, or ruffian. The first known use of the term punk rock appeared in the Chicago Tribune on March 22, 1970. Ed Sanders, co-founder of The Fugues, called his own solo album Punk Rock Redneck Sentimentality. The first music critic to employ the term was Greg Shaw, referring to a track by the Guess Who as good, not too imaginative punk rock. So, I guess the first punk rock band was Canadian then. Canada started punk. I'm just kidding. The term punk rock would be thrown around by a few journalists, never really landing, but used to describe a sound that was like the Yardbirds, but with loud, droning buzzsaw guitars. By 1972, the term punk rock was being used liberally in New York journalism as a musical term of endearment, and in 1973, Billy Altman launched the short-lived Punk magazine. However, this was mostly used to discuss 1960s garage and psychedelic bands. In May 1974, the Los Angeles Times critic Robert Hilburn reviewed the second New York Dolls album, Too Much Too Soon, describing the album as perhaps the best example of raw, thumb-your-nose-at-the-world punk rock. By 1975, punk was being used to describe bands like Patti Smith, the Bay City Rollers, and Bruce Springsteen. However, the scene at CBGB's, a venue in New York, was growing, and the search for a name for that particular style of rock was on. The name was quickly found, as Aquarius magazine is credited with using punk to describe what's going on at CBGB's. John Holstrom, Legs McNeil, and Jed Dunn debuted Punk magazine, which helped to critically solidify the term. It was pretty obvious that the word was getting very popular, Holstrom later remarked. We figured we'd take the name before anyone else claimed it. We wanted to get rid of the bullshit and strip it down to rock and roll. We wanted the fun and liveliness back. The birth of punk. While the roots of punk can be traced to the pub and garage rock roots of the 1960s, by 1974, a new scene was developing at CBGB's in New York. At its core was the band Television, who was described as the ultimate garage band with pretensions, whatever that means. The band's singer-slash-bassist Richard Hell created an aesthetic with cropped hair, ripped shirts, and black leather jacket that would become the basis of the fashion style for punks. Hell's song Blank Generation would go on to become the first anthem of the evolving punk scene. In June of 1974, Patti Smith recorded the singles Hey Joe and Piss Factory and released it on Myrrh Records, her own label, heralding the scene's do-it-yourself ethics. This is cited as the first punk rock record. In the same year, 4 musicians got together and adopted a common surname. The Ramones would play their first show on August 16, 1974, condensing rock and roll down to its most primal form. Guitars as white noise, drums as texture, and vocals as hostile, shouted slogans. In May of 1975, Malcolm McLaren would return to London after managing the New York Dolls. Inspired by the scene he had witnessed at CBGB's, he wanted to combine the over-the-top performance of the New York Dolls and Richard Hell's aesthetic. McLaren would use The Strand, a UK band that he managed, to help him promote the style. A frequenter of McLaren's anti-fashion store, Sex, Johnny Rotten would be pushed into the position of frontman of The Strand. After a name change, the Sex Pistols would play their first show on November 6, 1975. The Sex Pistols, with their radical, anti-establishment message and chaotic approach, would go on to bring punk to the mainstream and, in a way, destroy the idea of counterculture as quickly as it began. And thus the eternal argument: who started punk, the Sex Pistols or the Ramones? And now, to try and answer that question, I do not think that there is an exact answer to who started punk. There was a lot of factors. It wasn't just one band who, bam, now punk music is a thing. While the term may be associated to the Sex Pistols and the Ramones very heavily, it was a growing factor that took years and years to build. The growing unrest of the youth at the time, disenfranchised by the government and the system that they'd been placed in, the musicians who were sick and tired of over-the-top rock and roll music that just went on and on but said nothing, and the desire to create something without having to be beholden to record labels with more money than they knew what to do with, and the gatekeepers of that industry who decided who did and didn't get to make music. The beautiful thing about punk is that it came about because there were limitations in the world around them, and that's what's so beautiful about it. I don't think that any one band started punk. It was a movement that came out of the world changing, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. And even today, while doing the research for this video, I still, 50 years later, see parallels between what was happening in the world then and what's happening in the world now. And that's it for the video. Let me now know down below, who do you think started punk music? Was it the Ramones? Was it the Sex Pistols? Or was it somebody else altogether? I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to hear what band got you into punk. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel, and if you found this video insightful, entertaining, or informative, please obliterate that like button. As I said earlier, there is no sponsor for this video. However, I do have a wonderful community over on Patreon. The Weirdo Cult are super supportive of me, wonderful people that help to support me in my creative endeavors, and I love them so much. If you would like to help support me in my creative endeavors further in this crazy journey that I'm on to create content and make music, please consider joining the Weirdo Cult over on Patreon. You can join for as little as $1 a month, and you get early access to all of my content, exclusive music that you cannot get anywhere else, and you have your name included at the end of all of my videos, which you will see immediately following this. I'm Andy Negative, and I will see you guys on the other side. Bye! If you're seeing this, the video is now at its end, and if you could just do me one extra favor, I just released my very first novel that I'm very, very proud of. It's based off of my album SOS, and if you could go to Amazon and you could go purchase a copy and read it and maybe leave a review, it'd honestly mean the world to me. Please go do that if you want to, and if not, don't. Thank you.